Welcome, everyone, to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and on this podcast, I take a deep dive into the writing process behind some of the world's best songwriters. By way of background, I am a former English professor. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So this is a conversation about writing between two writers. My goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat prose writers, just as writers, plain and simple. So that's all we focus on. I don't care about tour stories, favorite bands, how bands get their name, favorite foods, anything like that. This is, again, a deep dive into the songwriting process with some of the world's best songwriters. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the podcast, it is Paul Muldoon. So Paul Muldoon has a new album out. Paul Muldoon is the songwriter. His backing band is called Rogue Oliphant, and their new album is called Visible from Space. But first, to appreciate Paul Muldoon as a singer, Paul Muldoon is far more, and I'm sure he would agree with me on this, far more well-known as a poet. If you took a contemporary poetry class in the last 40 years, you studied Paul Muldoon. I'm going to give you some quotes. I could not possibly do justice to his influence on poetry on the literary world, so I'm going to read you some quotes from some respected sources. The Irish Post said to describe Paul Muldoon's influence on contemporary poetry is like trying to assess the influence of the Beatles on post-war music. The New York Times Book Review said he's one of the great poets of the past 100 years who can be everything in his poems: wordplayful, lyrical, hilarious, and melancholy, and angry. Only Yeats before him could write with such measured fury. And the Times Literary Supplement called him, quote, the most significant English language poet born since the Second World War. That is who we are dealing with here when I'm talking about Paul Muldoon. He won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. He is a titan in the literary world. I hope those quotes do him justice. I studied Paul Muldoon in graduate school, saw him speak, so this was a real thrill. So this conversation is really a lot about writing, certainly not just about songwriting. And again, the new Paul Muldoon and Rogue Oliphant new album is called Visible from Space. But I'm going to read you a few quotes from the interview. Because this is really, again, I think we talked as much about poetry as we did about songwriting here. He said, so long as there is some shift in how we as writers think about the world, we're in good shape. I like that kind of the role of the writer. Because one of the things we didn't talk about is how he decides that something's going to be a song or something's going to be a poem. And he said that construction of a phrase decides whether it's a lyric or a poem. He decides what form a piece of writing is going to take at that point. I never know where it's going to end up, and that's part of why I do it. I like the adventure of the unknown. The one thing that he does, and he'll explain it, that it's fascinating, is because of being a poet, you really can't write a line until the one before it is fully formed. So he said, I don't leave a line until it is finished. All of the draft writing is about getting that first line. So he's you're seeing the drafts within the line there. And he admits this too, that'll drive a lot of writers crazy if you insist on revising as you write. So this was a truly special episode for me, but I think, again, because all of you are thoughtful people, if you listen to this podcast, take a listen. You may not read poetry. You should, I think. You may not, but listen to this episode with poet and songwriter Paul Muldoon. I always like to start with a very simple question. I think as a writer or as a songwriter, do you feel that it is important to create in some fashion every day, or not push things so that they don't become derivative?
Well, I do think that it's probably on balance a good idea to work in a fairly steady way. You know, That said, I'm not sure if I absolutely buy into some of the analogies that are made. The one that's most often made has to do with sport. In other words, if one doesn't keep the muscle in order, it's not going to be ready when you need it for the sprint or the marathon. I'm not sure if I absolutely accept that as a metaphor. Because I think the other side of that is in the writing business, it's probably best not to write unless one really has to do it. You know, I don't believe in doing it just for the sake of doing it. Um, this is a bit of a mishmash by way of an answer, but the other side of it is that I write almost every day. I'm writing something, working on something. It might be a lecture, it might be a poem, and it might be a song lyric. And the fact of the matter is that I don't really see any huge distinction between any of those activities. It's all part of one process. And I suppose the element that binds them together, as it were, be it a lecture, an essay, a poem, or a song, is that one wants to come out the other end of it thinking, wow, that's fabulous, or that's really interesting, or I wouldn't have thought that. That's an extraordinary image. I'm looking at the world in a slightly different way. So long as there's some shift in how we think about the world, then I think we're in business. And in terms of doing it every day, if it turns out that is going to be effective for one, fabulous. I don't see any necessity to do it every day. But the fact of the matter is that for many of us, it's so much fun as well as being hard work, that one ends up doing it almost every day. Sorry, that's a very complex bit of a mishmash of an answer, but it's there are lots of things happening.
So, how often do you get inspired either with song lyrics or just with the writing that you do? Because I hear this a lot from songwriters that things that they hear inspire them. Whether it's a sound, whether it's maybe not even a something someone says, maybe a sound from nature, or maybe something that they hear someone say in a conversation, overhearing a conversation at a bar, an airport, or something like that. Does that happen often?
It does. I mean, poems and songs begin in all sorts of ways. I mean, it is often a phrase. I mean, I've just written a song which goes. The title goes as follows: um, "You couldn't come up with what's going down." Now, that is unlikely to be a poem in my book. It's not to say that it couldn't be a poem in someone else's book, but there's something about that construction which sort of lends itself to the songwriting business. And indeed, you can imagine that you couldn't come up with what's going down. I'm not about to say that this is the most scintillating idea that has ever struck humanity. However, you can see that there's room for maneuver in there. It could be a country song, for example. It's the kind of wit that one, insofar as it is witty, it's the kind of wit that one might associate with the kind of the paradoxical aspect of so many country song titles. Um, but it's unlikely to be a poem. And that's usually one of the first choices, not so much that I make, but that the piece itself makes. As I say, it's very unlikely that you couldn't come up with what's going down is going to be announcing itself as a poem, at least not in my poetry world, for the most part. So things begin in all kinds of different ways, and one's open to an image, for example, a visual aspect, and I think by and large, actually, both songwriting and poetry are very image driven. You know, very image driven. Um, One sees something, then one sees something else. One stops looking at this, one starts looking at something else. And in both cases, song, lyric, and poem, I think what we might, um, for want of a better term, refer to as a cinematic aspect, right? Is to the fore. So that's a feature of both.
It's always struck me. I interviewed Lee Young Lee,
Oh yes.
um, probably 10 years ago. And I'll never forget this. And he's one of my favorite poets, as are you. And he said, he got up one morning and saw the image of his and his wife's body in the crumpled bed sheets in the morning, and I see crumpled bed sheets, and I think I need to make that bed. But he's a poet and a writer because he sees the outline of the body in the bed sheets. uh, I'll never forget that, and that reminds me when you said that, that reminds me of what he told me.
Yes. Well, what I would say about that is that it's quite likely that you would see exactly the same thing. You might see the outline. The big question then is, do you do anything about it? Do you move on and just make the bed? Or do you register the image? Are you predisposed to thinking, hey, what if anything might come of that? Is there room for expanding that, extending that, of finding some image in there that's going to resonate beyond itself. So I think it's really got to do with a habit of mind as much as anything else. If you're in the writing business, you tend to be predisposed. You're open to um, to visitations, right? Visual visitations, oral visitations. And rather than say, "Oh yeah, great, fabulous," letting it go, there's a possibility, a tendency to actually run with it. I mean, the big danger, of course, there's a danger running alongside that, which is that you take every little phrase that you hear, every image you see, as a reason for writing a poem or a song. So one has to be, I suppose, mindful of the ones that are actually really going to resonate, keeping an eye out for them rather than just writing all the time.
When you sit down, is there the thought, at what point do you say when you start to write, this is going to be a song, or this is going to be a poem? Did you decide early on, or did you just start to write and at some point you arrive at that conclusion?
I think it's pretty evident somehow which direction it might take. In my case, it is anyway. Um, let's think about this. One of the characteristics that certainly somehow straddles both these what word would I use, manifestations in my case, is that they're both very formal. I am a person who writes poems that tend to come into the world in ways that are perceived by many people to be very old fashioned, right? In other words, most of my poems rhyme, and many of them uh, have stanzaic patterns that, would have been recognizable 500 years ago. That just happens to be the way I am. I am predisposed to the formal. I'm not one of these people who says, "Look, rhyme went out somewhere, at least went out before the beginning of the 20th century, and anyone who uses rhyme nowadays is a complete sport, i.e., an outlier." Um, so there is a connection, as I'm saying, between that predisposition, to use the word again, and the predisposition of most, not all, but most songwriters having to do with using rhyme. There are very few songs, I'd say, that don't use rhyme. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, I think, why it's actually quite difficult to write a song, maybe even more difficult than it is to write a poem. This is certainly one of my theories, and insofar as I've developed any theories about anything at all, this would be one of them, which is that, if you're writing a song and you have a shape for the first um, verse and chorus, say, if it falls into that pattern, it's it's almost inevitable that something along those lines will happen in the second verse and chorus, and the and that actually is quite difficult for most people to do, including myself, particularly since most people nowadays are not really so versed in, if I may use that term, verse, right?
I want to shift gears slightly, and I interviewed Anthony Doerr a few years ago.
Oh, yes.
Um, and he told me, I asked him about writer's block. I'll never forget this. And he said, I don't believe in writer's block. He said, writer's block is a failure of courage. Uh, that's always stuck with me, the idea of not being afraid to write the bad stuff, that writer's block happens because we feel like we can't commit to the page until what we have is perfect or ready to go. Uh, so it reminds me also of the famous, I love the Anne Lamott essay, Shitty First Drafts. And so I'd love to get your take on that, writer's block and it being a failure of courage. What's your take on that?
Well, let's talk about writer's block first of all. I don't believe I've ever had it. I don't really know what it is. Um, And part of that, honestly, has to do with the fact that I don't expect to do anything. It goes back to what you referred to earlier on as what's known in some quarters as the daily practice. If you're committed to the daily practice and it doesn't happen, you might be inclined to say, "Oh my God, I have writer's block." See, I don't get involved in any of that at all. If I don't write, I'm not thinking, "Oh my heavens, what's gone wrong?" All I think is, well, there's nothing much happening today, and that's okay, because I do tend to fall behind John Keats's line about John Keats had so many great lines about I think it's John Keats. He's like Oscar Wilde. He said so many fabulous things that even if he didn't say them, you kind of ascribed them to him. He says, if poetry does not come as naturally as leaves to the trees, it had better not come at all. So that's a bit of an overstatement in itself, of course, because it does take a bit of work. On the other hand, one knows what it means. So writer's block is not something I am concerned about at all. The other element you brought up there is the element of the draft. Now, the kind of poem I write, and indeed the kind of song I write, I don't want to say that I don't write drafts, but let's say forget about songwriting for the moment. In the poetry business, I do not write what are generally conceived of or perceived as drafts. If you're writing poems that have the kind of formal complexity that most of mine have, you don't write a draft and think, I'll come back and tidy that up later on. The way I do it, and it astonishes many people, is that I start with line one, and I don't leave line one until it's finished, right? I don't leave it until it's finished. And people say, what on earth is he talking about? So, in other words, I put all the draft writing into getting that first line right. The drafts are all in there. And basically, I work on the principle that if line one leads to line two. And in fact, where line one ends and line two begins are intimately connected, right? So if one's using rhyme, for example, one has to more or less write it line by line. That's not to say I never go back and change things. Of course I do. But that's the way I work. I don't write a kind of run through of everything and then go back and start again. That, as far as I'm concerned, that's a waste of time. This is an idea, by the way, that is very offensive to many people who have bet the farm on the idea that to be a writer you have to write drafts and then you write another one. I myself don't do that. The kind of poem I write, as I say, you can't do that. It doesn't work. You don't go back and say, when you come to the end of line 2, you don't think, I'll come back and fix that next week. No way. You got to fix it right there. And one of the interesting knock-on effects of that actually is that if I get to, it goes back to your writer's block question, if I get to the end of line 2 and nothing much is happening, guess what? I leave it. I leave it. I go for a walk. I do something else. I go to the movies. I'm walking down the street. And in fact, the power of the subconscious or the unconscious is such that it will be working away for you. You can subcontract the unconscious, as it were, and have it work for you. So, maybe I'm not at all as worried about what many other people might think of as writer's block. I think of it just as a little break.
I want to ask about movement because I did want to discuss that too, the role of movement to the creative process. But I have a quote up here. I interviewed the songwriter Christian Lee Hudson a couple of months ago, and he said, "My biggest hurdle as a writer is trying to hack my brain to become less critical." So, in other words, getting out of his way as he writes. Um, so, but it does that ever a struggle? I think as you're writing, kind of getting out of your way, is it hard to be is it hard to be to avoid being critical as you write?
Well, two things spring to mind. I'm not sure if they're absolutely connected to what you're saying, but certainly the idea that one doesn't want to mess the thing up is very much to the fore. One has an image that's, it seems quite, what would one say? Um, Somehow it might have the legs to become something interesting, and in many cases the trick is not to overthink, right? Um, and to sort of try to allow it to find its way into the world as powerfully as it can, right? So, on balance, I'd say overthinking can be a bit of a problem, and the reliance on the unconscious mind is the more important aspect of the um, of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. Having said that, I believe one can't be too circumspect, right? One can't be too critical in many ways, and part of one's job as a reader is to bring that a critical component to the text as it's being produced, right? Quality control being applied. And of course, a lot of the time, particularly in the songwriting business, perhaps, one of the things that one's trying to do is to make it look as if no quality control went into it, right? To make it look as if no thought went into it, to make it look very natural. Um, and that's true of poetry also. You don't want the veins bulging in your biro, as it were, as somebody once described it, right? You don't want to see the work that's been done. It's that the work needs to disappear. In other words, the effort does not want to be evident. So, yes, it's now there was another element to your question there, or there was a separate question. What was it?
Well, I think it was more the sense of just, is it hard to, as you write, writers talk about getting out of their own way as
Yes.
they're writing.
S I think it's not for me, it's not in a strange way, it's not about getting out of my own way. It's about not getting in the way of what the poem or the song wants to do. So that's a slight variation on that, I think. Is it? I think it is. So, yeah, I don't want to be the problem, right? I want it to be the term I used a couple of times, and I still find it quite useful. I want the poem or the song to be what it most might be in the world, right? And to help it be that, to recognize insofar as one can what that might be, right? Does it look like something else? Is it in fact like something that we've never seen before? It might look like something else, but how do we know, in fact, it's doing something different at all? Um, those are among the questions that have been raised. But as I say, not to get in its way rather than one's own way. I think I myself, and this is true of many writers, I think I'm not interested in myself. I have no interest in myself. I really don't. If anything, this is true of the song tradition, of course. It's certainly true of the poetry tradition. It's true of both traditions. Anonymity and the quest for anonymity um, is a very real thing. I love the idea, and I've tried to do it a number of times. You know, trying to write the ballad, the song that smells of a ballad that could have been written 500 years ago, say. Um, and it could have been written by somebody you've never heard of. And the fact that you've never heard of them is almost a desirability. Anonymity, I think, is often a desirability that we don't know who wrote that song. And you know what? That's okay. And we don't know who wrote that poem. And guess what? That's okay too. And very refreshing, honestly, in a world, I mean, where poetry, insofar as anybody thinks about it at all, which is almost not at all, it's it's kind of hilarious to think of, the sort of the star poets, the ego driven poets, the poets who are interested in their personalities, their backgrounds, who they are, what they represent. And honestly, most of the time, I think, give me a break. I'm not
I want
interested in any of that at all. I'm interested in the poem. Is the poem any good? Now, the poem may reflect all of those things. It clearly reflects a personality. It reflects a society. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm only saying I don't want to see that up front necessarily. I want to see a really interesting construction in the world, which is what, of course, the word poem means. Um, I want to see an interesting construction in the world that makes me look again at the world, right?
All right, I want to get very specific with your process for a second, Paul.
Sure.
I had Jerry Harrison of the Talking Heads on a few months ago, and he said he has to write with a felt tip pen because he enjoys the sensation of the scraping on the page. Uh, and the number of songwriters who tell me that they are deeply specific with color of ink, type of paper, brand of pen, thickness of the head of the pen, the tip of the pen. How important is that? Are you very particular to those kind of things when you write?
In a certain sense, yes. In a certain sense, no. I mean, with regard to all of that, whatever floats your boat, and I can see that there's some sort of ceremony attached to the business. On the other hand, for the most part, I'm not really all that interested in that. Most of what I've written over the years, starting as a kid in the 60s, I suppose, um, has been written on a machine of some kind, starting out with a typewriter. And I mean, maybe I can be, in terms of the green felt tip pen, I could be fetishistic about the typewriter or its modern counterpart, the computer um, screen. Um, and I'm fetishistic in a certain sense in that I like to see what the thing looks like on the page, certainly in the poetry business, but even in the song lyric business. Um, I mean, on as crude a level as the length of the line. If you're writing with your felt tip pen, it can be it can very easily happen that, you've got a long line at the top and it kind of runs down the page like a cliff being eroded by the sea. The length of line is important in both these media, these forms. Um, and I also wanted to cut out early on in the poetry business for sure the idea of what it might look like when it was published. I sort of wanted to make publication less significant by having it look as if it might be published from the outset. I don't know if you understand what I mean by that. So you see it printed on your own little device. So that having it published is almost meaningless. It really is. Yeah, that was a feature. But honestly, whatever, whatever makes you happy, I'd say. But I myself am not particularly into that. I'm much more practical, I think, in terms of um, do I. One thing I do, and this is a throwback perhaps to my age and a reflection of my age, is I write my song lyrics, I type them out in block capitals, right?
Mm.
When I was a kid, you went to look at the lyric sheet on an LP, and I mean, both of these are quite remote concepts now for many people. They're not completely gone, but the song lyrics would be printed in caps, you know. And nowadays, of course, we associate caps with shouting and screaming. I refuse to buy into that, and uh, you know, as far as I'm concerned, capitalization does not mean raising one's voice and shouting. It doesn't necessarily mean that at all. It just means it's in caps. And anyway, there was a convention, I'm not sure if you're conscious of it, that song lyrics were published in caps. This is a long time ago. So I still do that. That's a little fetishistic, perhaps.
Well, I think that my fear with the ritual, because I have certain rituals in my process. For example, if I write in this chair, I'll revise in that chair behind me. My fear is when, and I talk to songwriters who are incredibly fetishistic about the process. I mean, it's got to be a blue ink and it's got to be this type of paper and this color of ink and things like that. My fear, if I do that, is that it puts too much pressure on it and that I'm less able to create if I feel like I've got to have the ideal environment to write in.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I particularly if one is moving around the world as actually many of these songwriters, I'm sure, are. And I certainly am. In a way, I need to be able to write anywhere. And so that may be one of the reasons why there's less ceremony, and in my case, less ceremony attached to it. I could be writing a poem on a plane, on a hotel room, in one house, another house. Um, it's kind of immaterial. That would be. Um, I'm trying to cut down the number of constraints, I suppose, that would make it less likely to be doing the thing at all.
Have you ever been the middle of the night type of writer where you need that the kind of silence in the world around you? I've never been able to do that, but is have you ever been able to be that? Are you a morning person, night person? Does that matter?
As it happens, I'm a morning person, but that's, as it happens. And usually I do write early in the morning every day, something. So I'm a morning person. Um, which is not to say that, I mean, insofar as I have such a thing as a best, I'm at my best in the morning. I'm not sure if it's good enough, really, but it's all I have. Um, but I'll tell you one thing, because so much of this is about habit, to go back to the fetishistic, and because in my own case I've been doing it for so long, if I have a bright idea, quote unquote, late at night, or I wake up in the middle of the night, which I usually don't actually. I usually sleep like a log. Um, but I have a bright idea. It, the first thing that comes to me in the morning is that bright idea. My body has, and my brain or whatever, has trained itself to be able to retrieve these moments and present them first thing the next morning. It's really quite interesting. Um, so at the end of the day, I suppose at the end of the day, I myself, and I'm sure many others, one's become just a little machine for making things. That's what I do. I don't, I'm not a chef. I'm not a gardener. I'm not a taxi driver. I'm not a limo driver. What else I can't fix a computer. There's a certain thing I do, which is to put one word in front of another and see how it goes. And that's basically more or less the only thing I do. And as I say, I have become everything, everything, it would seem, points in that direction. Everything is working to make that happen. As I say, it's not that I don't do other things. I do a little bit of cooking. I do a little bit of driving. And funnily enough, it's not that I think it's the end, it would be the end of the world, actually, as I've come to a certain age. If I actually wouldn't care if I never wrote another thing. It's very interesting. Um, Certainly, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't want to be writing anything that wasn't kind of half decent. I'd prefer to be writing nothing than writing something that was going to be garbage, Though, of course, one's very open to the idea that because, everything one writes is, extraordinarily wonderful. That is a problem.
All right, so you mentioned driving, and I'm going to end with this because I got some great quotes up here. I'm fascinated by the role of movement and creativity. And Agatha Christie once said the best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes. David Byrne said a car is a good place to write lyrics. Driving occupies one part of the brain, freeing up the other. Now, a lot of songwriters have told me they get ideas while they are mowing the lawn, gardening, chopping vegetables, folding laundry,
Yeah.
something that requires monotonous activity. And before you respond, that my one of my I love the book, The Friendship by Adam Sisman, about the friendship between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I
Oh,
believe in the
yes.
book, he said that they both composed almost all of their poems on walks. So
Yes, that's
I'm
right.
fascinated by that idea about the role of movement and about letting the unconscious bubble up. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Right. Well, let's see. I mean, I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg question here, in the sense that um, when one has cleared the mind, and that might be through the business of chopping carrots, right? Once just the mind is clear. Um, then I think one's out in a strange way, one's out of one's regular routine. There's a possibility, and it may be a greater possibility, that a stray thought, and a stray thought that is an interesting thought, may cross the mind. So I think it's got to do with the fact that one's out of one's regular um, routine, perhaps, though of course one could be chopping carrots every day, that there's a chance that the interesting thought might come in.
So do you use that deliberately? I certainly use walks as a way to kind of break through, but do you use that deliberately? Or again, it's that idea of once you do it deliberately, then it's no longer
Well, that's right.
conscious.
That's right. That's the kind of chicken and egg thing that I'm really thinking of. Yeah, I mean, certainly doing something else. As I was saying earlier on, if I get to the end of line 3 and somehow there's nothing happening in my poem or my song, I stop. I don't think, oh my heavens, the world is over. It's all over. I'm having a block. I just stop and I do something else. And that indeed might be taking a walk. And you're absolutely right. Wordsworth composed a lot of his poetry walking up and down at the end of the garden. Um, and it didn't guarantee that his poems were any good, of course. But that is a little bit of a problem with William Wordsworth. He was a fabulous poet earlier on, but really became a bit of an old bore towards the end of his life. He's an example that I fear one I don't myself really like to think too much about, because that's a fate that if it hasn't already happened, it's it's very likely to be the fate of most of us. But in any case, yeah. So freeing the mind, freeing the mind, having an empty mind, allowing one's on or subconscious to be preeminent is the key to doing anything interesting. As I say, it's not that one leaves the conscious mind behind. You need that too. But the really interesting things happen when when you give primacy to the unconscious or the subconscious.
And that's it for the latest episode of Songwriters on Process. You can find all of the old episodes on all major streaming platforms and probably some minor ones as well. You can also find them on the Songwriters on Process website. I started the site back in 2011, so that means there are hundreds upon hundreds of interviews with some of the world's best songwriters. So take a deep dive into some of those episodes. They are all great. Of course, I'm biased. Also, shameless plug, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, that is me, is out now on Hachette Books and in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend of mine. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God. And so we collaborated on his memoir. I'm biased, but that's a damn good book. Again, it is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir. And lastly, if you want to get in touch, go to the Songwriters on Process website. You can fill out a handy contact form and it'll get to me that way. You can also email me at ben@songwritersonprocess.com. I'm all ears. Send me your comments, your suggestions, your complaints, people you want me to interview. I get great suggestions all the time. I can't respond to all of the emails because I get a lot of them, but I do read all of them. And let me know your thoughts. If you have ideas for people you want me to interview, there's your chance. And with that, I am out. See you next time.